August 14th, 1858. Midnight. Somewhere in the suffocating heat of rural Georgia, beneath a moon that hung like a judge's gavel over the Belmont plantation, a secret was being unearthed in the slaves' quarters, a secret that would unravel a master's sanity and rewrite the unspoken laws of flesh, power, and possession. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and rot, and in a wooden shack that leaned like a penitent toward the earth, a midwife named Esther delivered a child who would become both curse and obsession to the man who claimed ownership of their very breath. This is not a story of love. This is a chronicle of possession turned to madness, of a body that defied the brutal simplicity of slavery's categories, and of a master whose hunger for control became his damnation. The child born that night, named River by their mother before she died 3 days later from fever, was intersex, carrying both marks of male and female in a world that had no language, no law, no mercy for such existence. In the antebellum South, where human beings were reduced to inventory and flesh was currency, River's very existence was a blasphemy against the order that kept cotton, white, and blood black. What River represented was not freedom, but something far more dangerous to men like Colonel Edwin Belmont, the collapse of certainty itself. River grew in shadow and silence, raised by the plantation's eldest women, who understood that survival meant invisibility. But the Colonel's eyes found what they should not have found when River turned 16 in the summer of 1874. No, forgive the math. When River turned 16 in 1874 is wrong. River was born in 1858, so at 16 that would be 1874, but our story begins earlier. Let us correct. River was raised in deliberate obscurity, but by 1870, at 12 years old, the Colonel's son, Thomas Belmont, discovered River bathing in the creek, and what he saw, what he thought he saw, became an infection in the Belmont bloodline that would fester into obsession, violence, and a reckoning that would burn hotter than Georgia's sun on cotton fields. And here, before we descend further into this American Gothic nightmare, I ask you, bear witness with me. If this story grips your conscience, let it grip your cursor too. Subscribe, comment below with your thoughts on how power corrupts not just through violence, but through desire itself, and stay until the end, because River's vengeance will be unlike any tale you've heard whispered. River's mother had been named Mercy, a cruel joke by whoever named her, because mercy was the one thing she never received. She had been a house slave, light-skinned, enough to serve the Belmont family their meals on fine china, dark enough to be reminded daily that she was property. When Mercy died 3 days after River's birth, the midwife Esther wrapped the infant in burlap and made a decision that would shape the next 12 years. She told the plantation overseer that the child was a boy. A simple lie, a survival strategy. In the slave quarters, where every breath was a negotiation with death, Esther understood that girl children faced horrors boy children might avoid, at least in their early years. So River became him, in the ledgers, in the roll calls, in the morning bells that summoned bodies to the fields. Esther raised River alongside her own grandchildren, teaching the child to move quietly, to answer quickly, to never meet white eyes directly. She bound River's chest when the first signs of development came at 11. She cut River's hair short with shearing scissors. She taught River to piss standing up behind the tobacco barn where no one would see. These were not cruelties, they were armor, but armor, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually fails. The creek where River was discovered that summer day in 1870 ran, cold even in August, fed by some underground spring that the enslaved people believed was blessed. It was one of the few places on the Belmont plantation where, for a few stolen minutes, a slave might feel something close to peace. River had gone there in the pre-dawn hours, believing the world still asleep, believing the White House still locked in dreams of its own superiority. The water was clear enough to see the smooth stones below, and River had stripped away the binding cloth, had let the creek wash away 12 years of pretense, had simply existed, as the body truly was neither the lie Esther told nor the categories the world demanded. That was when Thomas Belmont, 17 years old and already drunk on his father's whiskey and his own inheritance of cruelty, came riding through the woods on his mare. Thomas Belmont had been hunting or pretending to hunt, which was what wealthy Southern boys did when they wanted to escape their father's lectures about responsibility and legacy. He carried a rifle he barely knew how to use and a flask of bourbon that he knew too well. His horse, a chestnut mare named Delilah, picked her way through the pine shadows while Thomas swayed in the saddle, half asleep, half dreaming of the life he'd inherit. 600 acres, 200 slaves, and a bride already selected for him by his mother, some pale, boring daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant. He was bored, monumentally, existentially bored in the way only the son of a tyrant can be when the world has been promised to him without effort. Then he heard the water, the creeks whisper through the trees. He nudged Delilah toward the sound, thinking perhaps he'd water the horse, perhaps he'd wash his face, perhaps he'd do nothing at all except sit by the bank and drink until the sun climbed high enough to make his return to the house unavoidable. What he saw instead stopped him cold. River, standing waist-deep in the creek, water streaming down skin that caught the early light like polished mahogany, body exposed in its full truth, the small breasts, the narrow hips, the gentle curve, and the subtle contradiction that made Thomas's whiskey-soaked brain stumble over itself trying to comprehend. He should have turned away. A gentleman would have turned away. But Thomas Belmont was no gentleman. Despite his tailored coats and his family's pew at First Baptist, he stared, and in that staring, something shifted in him, not love, never love, but fascination edged with revulsion, desire tangled with disgust, the voyeuristic thrill of witnessing what he believed should not exist. River felt the gaze before seeing its source, turned, met Thomas's eyes for one long, frozen second, and in that second, River understood with perfect clarity that the armor Esther had built was shattered. Thomas said nothing, simply turned his horse and rode back toward the plantation house, his mind already spinning the discovery into something he could use, something he could own, something he could possess more completely than any human being should ever possess another. Thomas did not speak of what he saw, not immediately. That was the cruelty of it. The silence that followed was worse than any accusation. River returned to the quarters that morning expecting shouts, expecting the overseer's whip, expecting to be dragged before Colonel Belmont and questioned, examined, categorized, and then disposed of in whatever manner the white family deemed appropriate. But nothing came. The day proceeded as all days proceeded on the Belmont plantation. The bell at 5 in the morning, the distribution of cornmeal and salted pork, the long march to the fields where cotton stretched toward the horizon like a white ocean that drowned everyone who touched it. River worked alongside the others, hands moving, mechanically through the bowls, filling the sack that hung heavy across narrow shoulders, waiting for the revelation that never arrived. Esther watched River with ancient, knowing eyes but said nothing. At night, in the quarter's single-room shack they shared with 6 others, she finally whispered, "He saw you." It was not a question. River nodded in the darkness. "Then we wait," Esther said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had survived 60 years of slavery, by understanding that white people's silences were often more dangerous than their violence. And she was right. Because Thomas was not silent out of mercy or discretion, he was silent because he was planning. In the week that followed, he began to watch River with the intensity of a naturalist observing a rare species. He would ride past the fields and let his gaze linger. He would appear at the tobacco barn when River was tasked with bundling leaves. He would find excuses to summon River to the main house to carry firewood, to fetch water, to perform small tasks that required proximity. Each encounter was brief, laden with unspoken tension, and always Thomas would study River with eyes that held something between curiosity and hunger. The other slaves noticed. They always noticed. Whispers began to circulate through the quarters, whispers that River was marked, that the young master had taken an interest, that nothing good ever came from white men's attention, especially attention like this, which felt less like lust and more like the methodical fascination of someone pulling wings off a butterfly to see how it might struggle. Colonel Edwin Belmont was a man who believed in order. His plantation ran with military precision fields divided into neat squares, slaves assigned to specific tasks based on age and strength, punishments delivered on schedule to maintain what he called discipline and Christian hierarchy. He had fought in the Mexican-American War, had returned with a limp and a conviction that the world was divided into those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that this division was ordained by God himself. His wife, Margaret, was a Charleston debutante who had withered into bitter piety, spending her days reading scripture and her evenings drinking sherry until she could no longer recite the verses she claimed sustained her. Their marriage was a TUA of property and bloodline, nothing more. Thomas was their only surviving child. 3 others had died in infancy from fever, flux, and the general fragility of aristocratic bodies unused to the brutality of southern summers. The colonel had pinned all his dynastic hopes on Thomas, and those hopes were daily disappointed. The boy drank too much, read too little, showed no interest in the account books or the management of the estate, and possessed none of the iron backbone the colonel believed necessary for maintaining control over 200 human beings who, given the slightest opportunity, would burn the plantation to ashes. So when Thomas finally came to his father in late September of 1870, speaking in hushed tones about a discovery and something unusual among the property, the colonel listened with the wary attention of a man accustomed to his son's exaggerations. They sat in the study, a room dominated by a massive oak desk, hunting trophies mounted on walls, and a portrait of the colonel's grandfather, who had built the plantation on land stolen from Creek people and labor stolen from African bodies. Thomas paced. He stumbled over his words. He described River in fragments, unable or unwilling to speak plainly, his language circling around the truth like a dog circling a snake. And the colonel, for all his belief in order and categories, felt something cold settle in his chest, not disgust, but intrigue. Because men like Edwin Belmont did not just own bodies. They owned anomalies, curiosities, things they could display or destroy as proof of their dominion over nature itself. The examination happened on a Tuesday. River was pulled from the fields at noon, told nothing except to follow the overseer, a thick-necked man named Calhoun, who carried a coiled whip on his belt like a priest carries a rosary. The walk from the cotton fields to the main house felt eternal. Other slaves paused in their labor to watch, their faces carefully blank, but River could feel their prayers and their pity radiating like heat. The Belmont house loomed white and grotesque, its columns meant to evoke ancient Greece but achieving only the aesthetic of a mausoleum. River was led not to the front entrance but around back, through the kitchen, where house slaves averted their eyes, down a narrow hallway, and into a room River had never seen before, the colonel's private study. Colonel Belmont stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, silhouetted against the afternoon light. Thomas sat in a leather chair, legs crossed, affecting boredom but unable to hide the gleam in his eyes. And there was a third man, Dr. Archibald Henley, the plantation physician, a skeletal figure with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly from age or drink, or both. "Strip," the colonel said without preamble, without turning from the window. His voice was casual, the tone one might use to command a dog to sit. River's hands moved to the buttons of the rough cotton shirt, fingers numb, mind departing from body, in the way it had learned to do during previous violations, because this was not the first time River's flesh had been subjected to white scrutiny, though it was the first time the scrutiny carried this particular charge of fascination. The clothes fell away. River stood naked in the center of the study while 3 white men formed a triangle around that vulnerable flesh. Dr. Henley approached first, adjusting his spectacles, making small humming sounds of clinical interest. He touched, without asking, prodded, measured, lifted, examined with the detached curiosity of someone studying livestock. He murmured medical terms in Latin that River didn't understand. The colonel finally turned from the window, his face unreadable. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, no longer pretending disinterest, and River stood there, soul retreating further and further inward, until the body being examined felt like something separate, something that belonged to them in name only. Dr. Henley concluded his examination with the air of a man who had discovered a new species of insect. He wiped his hands on a cloth, muttered something about hermaphroditic presentation and developmental anomaly, and recommended that River be kept under close observation for what he vaguely termed scientific and medical purposes. The colonel listened with the expression of a man calculating value. In his world, everything had a price, a function, a use. Slaves were measured in pounds of cotton picked, acres plowed, children bred, but this thing standing naked and trembling in his study represented something different, not quite man, not quite woman, and therefore not quite fitting into the machinery of plantation economics that reduced human beings to their reproductive and labor capacity. He could sell River, of course, There were collectors of curiosities in Charleston and Savannah, men who kept private menageries of the strange and malformed. But Thomas had already spoken his claim, had already declared his interest, and the colonel, for all his tyranny, was indulgent with his only surviving son. "Dress," the colonel finally said, waving a dismissive hand. River's fingers fumbled with the clothes, pulling them on with desperate speed while the three men conferred in low voices by the desk. The words River caught were fragments. Keep in the house, away from the others, manageable, no breeding potential, but other uses. Thomas's voice cut through. "I want responsibility for it." The colonel paused, studying his son with an expression that might have been suspicion or approval. It was hard to tell with men who wore authority like armor. "You've never wanted responsibility for anything before." "I want this," Thomas insisted, and there was something in his voice, a petulance mixed with possession, that made River's skin crawl. The Colonel nodded slowly. "Then it's yours. But understand, Thomas, you break it, you account for the loss." They spoke of River as property, as object, as it, while River stood 3 feet away, fully capable of hearing every word, every negotiation of ownership. This was the violent slavery, perfected. Not just the theft of labor, but the theft of personhood, the reduction of a human being to a thing that could be given as a gift from father to son, like a watch or a horse or a hunting dog. River was moved to the main house that evening, not to the slave quarters attached to the kitchen where house servants slept in cramped rows, but to a small room on the 3rd floor, barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that overlooked the fields, stretching toward a horizon that might as well have been on the moon for all the freedom it represented. Esther was not allowed to say goodbye. The separation was immediate and absolute, designed to sever River from the only community that had offered protection, however fragile. That first night, River sat on the edge of the bed and understood with perfect clarity that this new arrangement was not a promotion or a mercy. It was isolation as a form of control. Thomas came to the room near midnight. River heard his footsteps on the stairs, uneven, heavy with drink, and knew what was coming before the door opened. But Thomas did not touch. Not that night. He simply stood in the doorway, lamp in hand, studying River with an expression that was almost reverential. "Do you know what you are?" he asked. River said nothing. "I've been reading," Thomas continued, swaying slightly. "Medical texts from Europe. They have names for what you are. Hermaphrodite, androgyne, neuter. But none of those words seem right." He stepped closer, and River could smell the bourbon on his breath, the tobacco smoke embedded in his clothes. "You're like something from mythology, a riddle, a creature that shouldn't exist but does." He reached out, and River flinched. But Thomas only touched River's face, a gesture that might have seemed tender if it weren't so clearly possessive. "You belong to me now," he whispered. "Not to my father, not to this plantation, not to whatever God made you this way. To me." Then he left, locking the door from the outside. River sat in the inert darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the distant songs from the slave quarters that no longer included River's voice, and understood that this was a different kind of slavery, not the communal suffering of the fields, but the singular horror of being someone's obsession, someone's private mystery to unravel, someone's thing to possess so completely that even the categories of human language bent around the owning. The weeks that followed established a grotesque routine. Thomas would visit River's room at irregular hours, sometimes in daylight, sometimes deep in the night, and the unpredictability was itself a form of torture. He brought gifts that felt like mockings, a dress one day, men's trousers the next, as if trying to solve the puzzle of River's existence through costume. He brought books and read aloud from them poetry by Byron and Shelley, passages from medical journals that described River's condition in cold, clinical language, even excerpts from the Bible that he twisted into justifications for his fascination. He talked incessantly, as if River were a confessor or a diary, unburdening himself of thoughts he could share with no one else. He spoke of his hatred for his father's rigidity, his contempt for the simpering Charleston girl he was expected to marry, his terror of inheriting a world he had no passion to maintain. And sometimes, in these monologues, Thomas would circle back to River with an intensity that made the small room feel airless. "You're the only real thing in my life. Everything else is performance. But you can't perform. You can't pretend to be what you're not because you are what you're not. Do you understand? River never answered these questions. Silence became a form of resistance, the only form available. But Thomas interpreted the silence as mystery, as depth, as invitation. He began to touch more freely, not with the brutal efficiency of rape, which River had steeled for and might have known how to survive, but with a possessive tenderness that was somehow worse. He would trace the lines of River's face, run fingers through River's hair, rest a hand on River's shoulder or thigh while reading aloud, as if establishing ownership through repetition and familiarity. The other house slaves knew something twisted was occurring on the third floor, but they could do nothing. Margaret Belmont, drowning in sherry and scripture, noticed nothing beyond her own misery, and Colonel Belmont, when he encountered River in the hallways during his son's absences, would simply nod with the satisfied expression of a man who had given his child a toy that finally held his attention. Winter came to Georgia with its deceptive gentleness, cold enough to require fires in the hearths, mild enough that the cotton still needed picking by hands that bled and cracked in the fields below. River watched the seasons change through the third-floor window, watched the slaves move like dark stitches across the white fabric of unharvested cotton, and felt the distance between that former life and this new captivity grow insurmountable. Esther was out there somewhere, growing older, perhaps believing River dead, or worse. The children River had grown up with were out there, their bodies being broken in the methodical way the plantation broke all bodies it touched, and River was here, in this room that was both prison and pedestal, being preserved like a specimen in formaldehyde for Thomas Belmont's private consumption. The physical violation, when it finally came, happened not with violence but with Thomas's warped version of ceremony. He arrived one December evening with candles, with wine stolen from his father's cellar, with a speech prepared about how River was too extraordinary for the ordinary laws of men and women, and how what he wanted was beyond the crude mechanics of master and slave. River understood, even through the elaborate language, that refusal was not an option, that consent was a fiction white people told themselves to sleep better, that this moment had been approaching since that morning at the creek, and all of Thomas's restraint until now had been merely the anticipation, the savoring of power not yet fully exercised. What happened in that room, River would later remember in fragments only. The candlelight casting shadows that made Thomas's face look demonic, the taste of wine forced past, unwilling lips, the pain and the confusion of a body being used in ways it was never meant to be used, and Thomas whispering throughout, whispering words like beautiful and mine and perfect, as if language could transform rape into something poetic. When it was over, Thomas wept. Actually, wept, his head on River's chest, crying about the profundity of connection and the loneliness of being the only person who understood River's true nature. And River lay there, staring at the ceiling, soul departed so far from flesh that the body beneath Thomas might as well have been empty. A husk, a thing already dead. The violation became routine. Thomas convinced himself it was love or something transcendent beyond love, something the limited moral imagination of his society could not comprehend. He began to speak of running away together, of going north, where they could exist, outside the suffocating categories of the South, where River's body would be seen as exotic rather than aberrant, where they could build some impossible life together. These fantasies were always spoken in the aftermath, in the vulnerable moments when Thomas allowed himself to believe his own delusions. River learned to nod, to murmur agreement, to perform the role of willing participant in whatever narrative Thomas needed to construct around his atrocities. This performance was survival. But beneath the performance, something else was growing, something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. River began to pay attention in ways that transcended mere observation, began to note the rhythms of the house. When the colonel took his evening walk through the tobacco fields, when Margaret retreated to her room with her sherry and her Bible, when the house slaves finished their duties and retreated to their quarters, leaving the main house in that particular silence that only wealth and isolation can produce. River noted where the colonel kept his pistols in a locked cabinet in his study, but the key hung on a ring he left on his bedside table each night. Noted that Thomas, for all his professed passion, was a creature of habit. He always drank before coming to River's room, always left the door unlocked during his visits because he liked the illusion that River could leave but chose to stay, always fell into a heavy sleep afterward, snoring with his mouth open like a child. River noted the rat poison kept in the kitchen for the periodic infestations that plagued even grand houses. Noted the arsenic the doctor had left behind for treating some ailment of Margaret's. Noted the straight razor the colonel used for shaving that sat on the washstand in his dressing room. These were not yet plans. They were possibilities. They were the raw materials from which vengeance might be constructed, and River catalogued them with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant waiting years for a single opportunity, and that when that opportunity came, you had to be ready to take it without hesitation or mercy. Spring of 1871 brought changes that would accelerate everything toward its inevitable conclusion. The Charleston girl, her name was Abigail Thornton, finally arrived for an extended visit, chaperoned by her disapproving mother and accompanied by enough luggage to suggest she was moving in permanently. She was 18, pale as milk, with the kind of fragile beauty that Southern society prized. Small-waisted, demure, accomplished in needlework and piano, utterly devoid of anything resembling independent thought. Margaret Belmont rallied from her sherry-soaked stupor long enough to play hostess, organizing teas and garden parties, parading Abigail before Thomas like a prize mare at auction. The colonel watched these proceedings with satisfaction, believing that marriage and responsibility might finally cure his son of whatever peculiar malady had gripped him through the winter. But Thomas was not cured. If anything, the presence of Abigail, this embodiment of everything conventional and expected, intensified his obsession with River. He began to visit the third floor, with greater frequency, with greater desperation, speaking now not of running away but of keeping both lives, the respectable marriage that would satisfy his parents and society, and the secret possession of River as his private truth. She means nothing, Thomas would insist, drunken maudlin, his hands on River's body. She's a transaction, but you're real. You're the only real thing I have. River listened to these assurances and understood that Thomas's version of love was simply another architecture of imprisonment, that in his twisted cosmology, River would forever be the hidden thing, the shameful secret, the creature kept in the attic, while the legitimate wife bore legitimate children downstairs, and something in River, something that had been bending under the weight of months of violation, finally snapped. Not loudly, not with rage or hysteria, but with the quiet, absolute clarity of someone who realizes that survival is no longer enough, that there are things worse than death, and that sometimes the only moral response to a world built on atrocity is to burn it down. The plan began to take shape, not all at once, but in increments, in careful observations, in the accumulation of small acts of preparation that Thomas, in his arrogance, never noticed. Pause here, in this moment, before everything ignites. Before we descend into the final act of this American horror, understand what you are witnessing, not a love story, but a dissection of power's most intimate violences. River's story is not unique. It echoes through centuries of bodies denied the right to define themselves, bodies made into objects, mysteries, possessions. If this narrative has gripped you, if you feel the weight of River's silence and the cold calculus of survival transforming into vengeance, then let me ask you to do something. Subscribe to bear witness to stories the comfortable world would rather forget. Comment below. What would you have done in River's position? What is justice when the law itself is the instrument of oppression? Stay with me. Now, what comes next is not redemption, it's reckoning. And River's name will be whispered long after the Belmont dynasty turns to dust. The wedding was planned for June 15th, 1871. Invitations had been sent to every prominent family within 100 miles. The house was being prepared with an another intensity that bordered on mania, Margaret overseeing the polishing of silver, the hanging of garlands, the procurement of enough food and liquor to feed 200 guests in the manner befitting the Belmont name. Thomas moved through these preparations like a sleepwalker, performing his role adequately enough to satisfy his parents while spending his nights on the third floor, alternating between violating River and weeping about the cage his life had become. He spoke, during these visits, of elaborate schemes. After the marriage, he would build River a cottage on the far edge of the Bevert property, would visit whenever he could, escape Abigail's company, would maintain both worlds indefinitely. River listened and nodded and made careful mental notes. The house keys hung on a ring in the colonel's study. River had watched Thomas lift them once to unlock the liquor cabinet. The rat, poison sat in a tin marked clearly in the kitchen pantry. accessible during the chaos of wedding preparations when house slaves moved through every room with armfuls of linens and flowers. The straight razor still sat on the colonel's washstand, cleaned and stropped each morning by the slave who served as his valet, and the pistols, those remained locked. But River had discovered something Thomas himself had revealed in a drunken confession. His father kept a loaded derringer in the desk drawer, unlocked, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. The plan crystallized in the week before the wedding. It would have to be comprehensive, not just Thomas, but the entire structure that had created and maintained this horror. The colonel, who had examined River's naked body with the detached interest of a livestock appraiser, Margaret, who knew something evil was occurring in her house, and chose sherry-soaked ignorance over intervention. Abigail was innocent, perhaps, but her innocence was the innocence of those who benefit from atrocity without having to acknowledge it. The house itself, this white monument to stolen land and stolen bodies, would have to burn, not as symbol, but as practical necessity. Fire destroys evidence. Fire purifies. Fire speaks a language older than law. June 14th, 1871, the night before the wedding. The house glowed with lamplight and simmered with anticipation. Abigail and her mother had retired early to prepare for the morning ceremony. The colonel had gone to bed by 10, exhausted from a day of receiving arriving guests and playing the magnanimous patriarch. Margaret had drunk herself into unconsciousness by 9, collapsed in her room with an empty sherry bottle cradled like an infant. The house slaves had finished their duties and retreated to their quarters, grateful for a few hours of sleep before the chaos of wedding day would begin at dawn. Thomas came to River's room at 11, as predictable as clockwork, already drunk, already maudlin, carrying a bottle of his father's best bourbon, and wearing the expression of a man at his own funeral. "Tomorrow I become what they want me to be," he slurred, slumping onto the narrow bed. "But tonight I'm still mine, and you're still mine." He drank, he talked, he cried. He forced himself on River one final time with a brutality born of desperation, as if he could somehow possess more completely through increased violence. And when it was over, when he lay spent and vulnerable, River whispered for the first time in months, "I have something for you, a gift, for your wedding day." Thomas, surprised to hear River's voice after so long a silence, lifted his head with pathetic eagerness. "What is it?" River rose from the bed, naked and trembling, but the trembling now was not fear. It was anticipation. From beneath the mattress, where it had been hidden for 3 days, River withdrew the derringer. The colonel's derringer, lifted from his study during the chaos of wedding preparations when every door stood open and every eye was turned toward festivity rather than security. Thomas's expression moved through confusion, disbelief, and finally too late fear. "River, what are you?" The first shot took him in the throat. The second, as he clutched at the wound and made wet, choking sounds, entered just below his left eye. Thomas Belmont died on the floor of the room where he had committed months of violence, his blood soaking into the same floorboards where River's dignity had been murdered nightly. River moved through the house like a ghost, like a fever dream, like the angel of death that had passed over Egypt in the stories Esther used to tell. The derringer was empty now, but the straight razor from the colonel's washstand was sharp enough to split hairs, sharp enough to open throats. The colonel died in his sleep, never waking, which was more mercy than he deserved, one clean cut across the carotid, and he simply bled out into his monogrammed pillows, his dreams of dynasty ending in wet silence. Margaret required no blade. River simply stood in her doorway and watched as the woman who had chosen willful blindness choked on her own vomit, too drunk to roll over, too far gone to save herself. River could have turned her head, could have prevented the death, but chose instead to bear witness to the suffocation, to watch the karmic poetry of a woman drowning in the substance she had used to drown her. Conscience. Abigail was asleep in the guest room, innocent in her white nightgown, dreaming perhaps of her wedding day. River stood over her with the razor for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, considering. This girl had done nothing directly, had not touched River, had not violated River, had not even known of River's existence, but she was complicit in the machinery, her willingness to marry into this family, to bear children who would inherit slaves, to perpetuate the system that ground human beings into profit. River could have killed her, perhaps should have killed her, to complete the extermination, but instead, River pressed a hand over Abigail's mouth and whispered close to her ear, wake up and see what your marriage bed was built upon." Abigail's eyes opened, confused, terrified. River released her and stepped back. "Run, River," commanded. "Run now and tell them what you saw. Tell them that River the slave, River the hermaphrodite, River the thing your husband to be kept locked in the attic, killed them all. Tell them I am heading north. Tell them to send their hunters and their dogs." Abigail ran, screaming into the night, crashing down the stairs in her nightgown, fleeing toward the slave quarters where people might protect her. River did not run north. That was the lie planted for Abigail to carry, the false trail for the hunters who would inevitably come. Instead, River went to the kitchen and retrieved the lamp oil stored in large tins for the household's many lamps. Methodically, with the patience of someone performing a sacred ritual, River moved through the ground floor, pouring oil across the Turkish carpets in the parlor, soaking the velvet curtains in the dining room, drenching the colonel's study where the examination had occurred, splashing it up the mahogany staircase where Thomas had climbed nightly to commit his violations. The house had to burn, not as revenge alone, but as erasure, as a declaration that some crimes are too enormous to be answered with anything less than total destruction. River saved the third-floor room for last, that narrow cell where months of horror had unfolded, poured the remaining oil across the bed, across the floorboards still sticky with Thomas's blood, across the walls that had witnessed everything and said nothing. Then, River struck the match. The flame caught instantly, racing across the oil trails with hungry enthusiasm, and within minutes the Belmont house was an inferno visible for miles. River descended through the smoke and heat, moved through the kitchen where house slaves were already fleeing in panic, and walked calmly out the back door into the night. The slave quarters were in chaos, people running toward the fire, running away from it, shouting questions, clutching children, trying to understand what was happening. River found Esther standing in her doorway, illuminated by the orange glow of the burning house, and their eyes met across the distance. Esther nodded once, a benediction, an understanding. Then River turned toward the woods, toward the creek where this had all begun, and disappeared into the darkness while behind, the Belmont plantation burned like a beacon, like a warning, like a funeral pyre for a dynasty built on blood. The fire burned for 3 days. When it finally died, nothing remained but ash and the twisted metal skeleton of what had been the South's proud architecture of oppression. River was never found. The hunters came with their dogs and their righteousness, searching the woods and dragging the creeks, following Abigail's testimony north toward the promise of freedom that every escaped slave was presumed to seek. But River had gone elsewhere, or nowhere, or everywhere, depending on which whispered story you believe. Some said River made it to the Gullah communities on the Carolina coast, disappearing into those villages where African traditions still held strong, and a person's body was their own sacred mystery, not subject to white categorization. Others claimed River joined the maroon colonies deep in the Okefenokee swamp, living among those who had chosen wilderness and danger over slavery's certainties. A few swore they saw River years later in New Orleans during Reconstruction, passing as a man and working as a dock laborer, or passing as a woman and singing in a Rampart Street establishment, or passing as person, neither, and simply existing in the fluid spaces that cities unlike plantations sometimes allowed. The truth is unknowable, and perhaps that's fitting. River had spent a lifetime being defined, categorized, examined, and possessed by people who believed they had the right to determine what River was. Let River's ending remain undefined. What matters is not where River went, but what River left behind. 3 dead Belmonts, a plantation house reduced to ash, and a story that spread through the slave quarters of Georgia like wildfire itself. The story changed with each telling, grew more elaborate, more mythic, more symbolic. River became a legend, whispered in the fields, invoked in prayers, transformed into something larger than one person's vengeance. River became the embodiment of every slave's unspoken fury, every violated body's dream of retribution, every impossible person's refusal to be categorized into non-existence. And on certain nights, when the moon hangs low over Georgia and the air smells of magnolia and smoke, they say you can still see River walking along the creek, neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free, but something the masters never had words for, ungovernable, uncontainable, undefeated, a ghost not haunting, but witnessing. A myth not comforting, but true. River. The name itself became a verb among those who remembered. To river, meaning to burn down the house of your oppressor and walk away into legend, leaving only ashes and questions behind.